The great Christian writer Dallas Willard once said, "The greatest issue facing the world today, with all its heartbreaking needs, is whether those who by profession or culture are identified as Christians will become disciples, students, apprentices, practitioners of Jesus Christ, steadily learning from Him how to live the life of the kingdom of the heavens into every corner of human existence." Now, that's a lofty claim, but it's the call that has been given to the church over the many years of its existence to make disciples. And we saw over the previous weeks that there are two aspects of disciple making. One that we saw last week was the call to baptize. And this week, today, we're looking at the second aspect of disciple making, which is to teach. Teaching everyone to observe all that Jesus has commanded. And that's been the standing order for the church. Because in His teachings, Jesus laid down a blueprint for a flourishing world. And the call is for Jesus' followers to pass it on. Now, having said that, here's the problem. In the eyes of many, this call, this project, if you will, of the church, doesn't seem to be working. It hasn't produced the kind of disciples that's described here in the quote that would lead to the kingdom of the heavens being lived out in every corner of human existence. So we have to ask the question of whether this whole project is a sham or if we're missing something in the call that has been passed down to the church. And what I want to do today as we examine this passage is I want to reclaim this command by looking at it with fresh eyes. So we're going to go through this command through 3 points. First, we're going to look at what is to be taught. Secondly, who needs to teach. And lastly, the power behind the teaching. What needs to be taught, who needs to do the teaching, and the power behind the teaching. So let's go through each of these points one by one. First, what is it that needs to be taught? Jesus here says, teach them to observe everything that I commanded you. And I want to emphasize the word here, the word everything. And this was always Jesus' emphasis, to teach everything, the entirety of the law. Jesus says in Matthew 5:18, He says, I tell you the truth, until heaven and earth disappear, not even the smallest detail of God's law will disappear until its purpose is achieved. See, if you're working off of a blueprint to build something, you can't just pick and choose what you want to build from the blueprint, or else the whole structure is going to collapse. And much of the problem that I see in the church today is that we've gotten used to selective teaching. And in most cases, I found that churches tend to, and this includes me as a primary teacher here at Joy, in one of two camps. There are those who emphasize the teaching around private morality and devotion, matters of the internal heart, if you will. And there's the other camp that likes to emphasize public morality and love talking about societal and cultural issues. But see, when Jesus says, I want you to teach everything that I commanded you, He's saying this teaching is not like a buffet where you get to pick and choose the things that you like and discard the rest, because Bible addresses all of it. Let me give you two quick examples. See, first, the Bible talks about sexual morality. And so you hear Jesus saying in Matthew chapter 5, verses 27 to 28, Jesus says, you have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. Now that's talking about a social ill. But then Jesus says, but I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Jesus is now addressing the issue of the heart. One other example, the Bible also talks about religious devotion. And in Matthew chapter 23, verse 23, Jesus rebukes the scribes and the Pharisees, the religious leaders of the time, saying this. He says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites." Now why? He says, "For you tithe mint and dill and cumin." These were kind of highly sought after spices that they would tithe, referring to their private devotion. But then he goes on to say, even though you tithe mint and dill and cumin, he says, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. And he says, these you ought to have done without neglecting the others. He's saying, you have private devotion that remain within your nice, cozy religious community, but that devotion has not spilled out into love that ought to have been demonstrated in the public square, particularly towards the poor and the marginalized. And here's the danger behind selective teaching, is that it leads to powerless disciples that make little to no impact in the world. On the one hand, you have the Ned Flanders from The Simpsons, the Ned Flanders types that are nice, polite, but they have no impact on the world around them. And if you know the character, you know that there's nothing intriguing or attractive about a person like that. But on the other hand, you have the hypocrites that may be outspoken about political and cultural issues, but are either jerks on the inside or have very serious character defects that negate their message. And both are powerless to make an impact in the world. That's why Jesus says, all that I have commanded need to be taught. Matters of the heart, matters of social implications and cultural implications, and all of the above. And that's what leads to an impactful, powerful witness. And even as I teach this, it's been a kind of a challenge for me, a challenge for not just myself, but for all of us as elders, as I was reminded of the Apostle Paul's confession that comes to us in Acts chapter 20. And he's saying goodbye to a church that he's loved and pastored. And he says this, I testify to you this day that I am innocent of the blood of all, for I did not shrink from declaring to you the whole counsel of God. I wonder if I can say that with a clean conscience. But that's the importance, to teach the whole counsel of God, to teach everything that Jesus has commanded for them to be observed, for them to be obeyed. Now, that's a lot of pressure. You may be thinking, wait, that's what I'm called to do? Is this really a command for me to obey? And that's the next question that I want to address, right? Who is it that needs to teach? Is this command given to every Christian? The passage that was just read for you certainly seems to appear so to every Christian that is following Jesus. But if you look through the rest of the New Testament, it also seems to point to the teaching office given to people that are specifically set aside for the ministry of preaching and teaching. So which one is it? Is a call given to every Christian, or is it given to, let's say, pastors? And here I see two errors that I commonly find in the church. On the one hand, you have some folks that have completely offloaded the call to teach entirely to pastors. And so they say, I'm just going to worry about being a good person, and I'm not going to worry about all this Bible and theology stuff. I don't need to learn it. And the danger there is that they become completely reliant on 30-some-odd minute sermons that they hear once a week that will really never lead to any lasting change as they go about their daily lives into their workplace and into their homes. But the other error that I often find in the church is that there are some folks who take it upon themselves. They say, okay, I'm ready to go. I'm ready to teach and do all of that without training or qualifications. And there's danger there as well, because over the years in my ministry, I've seen so many people that have been given so much bad advice that needed to be untangled, that they needed to be healed from. I've seen lives destroyed because of bad advice. And these advice givers are especially dangerous because the things that they say are often truisms that have an air of spirituality to it. And especially if you're the charismatic type or if you're respected in the church, people are going to pay attention to what you have to say. A lot of times take it to heart. See, these are the two errors. On the one hand, to offload the call completely to pastors. On the other hand, to take it upon themselves. So what is the biblical pattern? In the Bible, you see two kinds of teaching. Okay? One kind of teaching is what we would call authoritative teaching. And the other is what I would call applied teaching. Authoritative teaching and applied teaching. Authoritative teaching is the kind that Jesus handed down specifically to be taught by his disciples that were then passed down through the church leaders throughout church history. These are to be, this role of authoritative teaching is to be given to those who are specifically appointed by the church and set aside, whether it's to ordination or different kinds of appointment and installation, to people that are especially gifted and qualified and equipped to teach in an authoritative manner, to guard the doctrines of the church or the blueprint for the kingdom that Jesus laid down to us. These are the folks that are specifically set aside to preach and teach straight from the Bible in an authoritative manner. So that's the first kind of teaching. But the second kind of teaching is what I would call applied teaching. So if the first kind is reserved for those who are specifically set aside, the second kind of teaching is reserved for every single Jesus follower that is looking to take the truth that's been handed down to them and apply it to their daily life. And their role is not necessarily to give advice as an authoritative truth, and we've seen how dangerous that can be, but it's humbly seeing the truth come alive in everyday life and testifying to His power and His beauty. See, one of the most powerful examples of the latter being carried out faithfully is when we hear testimonies, especially on Sundays that are given to the entire church. And if you're anything like me, this may be true of you. I find that, sermons are great. I love listening to great preaching. But testimonies resonate in my heart in a very different way. And oftentimes it can be a lot more powerful than a great sermon. Why? Because all of these truths that are given to us through faithful and powerful preaching is great. But in testimonies, you experience the power and the beauty of the truth coming alive in another person's life. And what that shows us is that the blueprint that Jesus had laid out in His teaching is actually not a sham. And it does have the power to change everything. And we get a glimpse of that through the testimony. So this applied teaching that every Jesus follower is called to do is a powerful one. So who needs to teach? Authoritative teaching needs to be done by pastors and those who are qualified. But applied teaching that could be just as powerful, if not more, that's the call that is given to every Jesus follower. And that means it is incumbent on us to receive truth. It can be through preaching, but we're doing this together as a church. We're going through the Bible day by day. To go through the entire Bible in a year in your private devotions is to receive that truth and to see it come alive in your life and testifying to its effect and the way it's changing your life. That is the call for every Christian. Now, how are we to do this? What is the manner in which we are called to teach? So that's the last point that I want to get to. Now, for this point, I want to, by way of illustration and instruction, give you a story that comes to us from John chapter 4 that I think is really helpful in this point. Now, in John chapter 4, Jesus travels through Samaria, and He meets a woman at a well that was in Samaria along the path that He was traveling. And this woman has a transformative encounter with Jesus. And after this encounter, this woman goes into her town and spreads the message. How does she do it? She does it it happens in 2 steps. John chapter 4, verse 29, here's what the woman says. She says, "Come, see a man who told me all that I ever did. Can this be the Christ?" See, this woman had an encounter with Jesus where Jesus knew about the details of her life that he had no business knowing. And so what she could have done was go into town and say, "Let me teach a lecture on the omniscience of God, the all-knowing God." She could have done that, but instead, she doesn't lead with doctrine. She doesn't lead with theology. She doesn't lead with assertions. What does she do? She leads with her story. She says, "Here was a man who told me everything that I ever did." She took the truth that was applied and experienced in her life, and she shared it with others. That's the applied teaching. Is to share your story, to lead with vulnerability. So you don't need to have all the answers figured out for you to be able to teach. But what is required of you is to have an encounter with Jesus yourself, to have experienced Him, and to have had the truth of who He is and what He has done, having come alive in your heart. That's what needs to happen. You may not be an expert in theology. You may not be an expert in the doctrines of the faith. But you need to have experienced Jesus firsthand. If you have done that, if you've experienced that, you are qualified to teach in this way. All that's required of you is your vulnerability and a willingness to share your story. So that's the first step. But what happens? Verse 40 to 41. These Samaritans, people in her town, having heard this woman's story, they start coming to Jesus. And verse 40 to 41 tells us, when the Samaritans came to him, they asked him to stay with them, and he stayed there 2 days. And listen to what he said. What it says, and many more believed because of his word. See, the townspeople, having received the applied teaching of the woman at the well, they were invited to Jesus, and they heard the words directly and authoritatively from him. And they came to believe. Many more came to believe because of his word. This correlates to the authoritative teaching and preaching ministry of the church. So how do you teach? You teach by leading with your vulnerability, leading with honesty. This woman had a story that was shameful for her, a story that she wanted to hide. But when she saw Jesus for who he was, who knew all of the things that she had ever done, she nevertheless went into town and told everybody about it. It starts with vulnerability. It starts with a willingness to share your story. And whenever that person may be ready, they will be drawn into the church to receive the kind of authoritative teaching and preaching of the truths of the gospel that will then, in turn, change their lives as well. Friends, this is what it means to teach everyone to observe all that Jesus had commanded, not just parts of it, but in its totality. And not just as information transfer, but to lead to a life that is transformed. See, we said in the beginning, the hope of the world, according to the Bible, is disciples that are truly transformed from the inside out to carry the values and the priorities and the lifestyle and the beauty and the glories of heaven into every sphere of life. How is that going to happen? Through the teaching ministry of the church that every single Christian is called to. It's when they see, when they are not told, but shown, that the blueprint that Jesus had laid out for the world through his teachings are actually powerful has the power to change your life. Let me just say this in closing. There's a writer by the name of Elaine Scarry who wrote a book on beauty. And she said this about gardens that I think apply just as well to human beings. You'll see what I mean in a second. She said, gardens exist for the sake of being beautiful and for the sake of having that beauty looked at, walked through, lingered in. Saying that's what gardens are for. What are human beings for? Why were we created? When God created humanity, what did He say? God didn't say, and behold, it was very useful. He didn't say, and behold, it was very right. He said, and behold, it was very good. God created us to be beautiful, to be good, and to exude and minister that beauty to the rest of creation. Friends, this is the blueprint that we are called to teach, to build towards not just a moral life, but a beautiful life. We are called to build ourselves up, to be a beautiful humanity, living in a beautiful world for the glory of God. That is why we were created, friends. In a world that is ugly with hatred and division and sin, this is what the church has to offer. The beauty of the blueprint that Jesus had laid out for the world that reflects His kingdom. And the call for the church is to radiate this beauty out one person at a time. And once we accept this call, friends, this is what unleashes the power of Jesus' teaching that will change the world. So friends, will you come meet with Jesus? Will you learn from Him? And will you see and apply this truth into your life, experience His power, and share it with others as we look to do this together as a church? Let's pray.